Amen. A question that's arisen in this movement, and something that I guess Adventists may ask generally, something that I thought most people believed in and agreed with, but I'm not sure if everybody does, is the fact that Christ wanted to return in the history of the Millerites. That what he wanted, it was his desire, his will to return before 1888. So I just want to read a statement about that, a comment. This is taken from Last Day Events, page 37. Last Day Events, page 37. Last Day Events, page 37. The long night of gloom is trying, but the morning is deferred in mercy, because if the Master should come, so many would be found unready. So that's just to give you some context of why there is a delay. It's taken from Testimonies to Church, Volume 2, that was written in 1868. The long night of gloom is trying, but the morning is deferred in mercy, because if the Master should come, so many would be found unready. So even in 1868, Ellen White is explaining why there is a delay. So people ask, what would the line of the Millerites look like? And many of us have taught in the past that the Millerite line would end in 1844 and begin in 1798. This 46-year history. We know that's not correct. That the history of the Millerites does not end in 1844, and in fact it was never going to end in 1844. And the reason it was never going to end in 1844, because though 1844 is the end of the 2300-day prophecy, we know that it's not the cleansing of the sanctuary that's here as we know it, the earth. The sanctuary that's being cleansed. Total different meaning. We discussed this yesterday. Hopefully we may be able to review this. But it was never going to end in 1844, October 22nd. After Christ would begin the investigative judgment, Daniel chapter 7, the work would go from the dead to the living, and sometime soon after the judgment of the living would begin, we'd have the closing events of the great controversy, which would be the National Sunday Law, the close of probation, and the Second Advent. Now in that history, because those events were never fulfilled, there is no accurate way of understanding what those events would have actually looked like. All we can get is some hints based upon the themes of what those waymarks actually mean or what they represent. We cannot with accuracy fully explain all the details of what those things are referring to. So a number of us have seen presentations done by Sister Tess that goes through that history and explains that it's the issue of slavery which results in the American Civil War of 1861, ended in 65, that is really the fulfillment of this history. But it's a bit more complex than that, of course, because in order to have the close of probation of the Second Advent, there must be some form of predicting it. And we can see that the Millerites, after 1850, when this chart was produced, they began to lose direction, they began to lose track of where they were going. They enter into a Laodicean condition. if I can put it that way. And because of that Laodicean condition, they lose the ability to be able to predict the future with accuracy and certainty. So even though we have historical events, aka the American Civil War, the issue of slavery, what we don't have is a corresponding work internally in the church. So that punishment, as Ellen White frames it, that's going to be poured upon the United States, the Civil War, because of the sins that they have committed, slavery, we don't have a corresponding work within the church because they've entered into a Laodicean condition, and we are no longer fulfilling the gospel mission to basically tell them that the great test is coming, the close of probation is about to happen, and Christ is about to return. We have an explanation of why that was so. So it's in that context that we're reading these passages, but what we do know is that Christ's, his desire, his will, was that he was going to return in that generation, which is, in the context of history, relatively early. Certainly before 1888. We have inspired quotes, which I'll read to you now, that demonstrate he was meant to come back before 1888. And we can go back into that history and put the pieces of the puzzle together, and we can show that the second advent would be connected to the American Civil War. We already know, based upon a "Thus saith the Lord" inspired quotes, that the close of probation was also connected to the American Civil War as well. A problem that Adventists have is that we are fixated by two waymarks in two separate histories. In the history of Christ, what is the premier waymark that, I say Adventists, I could say Christians, but Adventists is a better reference point in our context. What's the premier waymark in the history of Christ that all of us look to? No. It's the cross. The cross is the premier waymark in the story of Christ. Without the cross, there is nothing. It's the cross that everything gravitates to, and it's not just in the history of Christ. The whole of the great controversy gravitates to that waymark. In fact, we read a statement that when Moses went to collect the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai, he was shown two things: Ten Commandments and the cross. The glory that shines from his face wasn't a reflection just of God's character, wasn't a reflection of the light that came from the Ten Commandments. It was a reflection from the cross. We read those Ellen White quotes that dealt with that. So it's the cross that is the premier waymark in the history of Christ. Come to the end of the world. What's the premier waymark that Seventh-day Adventists go on and on about? It's the Sunday law. And because we have got this perspective of both of those waymarks, what we end up doing is creating a framework, a story, a narrative that centers around these two points of history: the cross and this waymark here, the National Sunday Law. But the problem is this: if you take just inspiration, whether it's Ellen White's quotes or Paul in the New Testament, what is Paul going to go on and on about, talking about the work of the Messiah? Which waymark? The cross. If you're going to ask Ellen White, which waymark does she continually want to remind us and speak to? It's National Sunday Law. We read it earlier. We're messing around in the former rain, therefore we're not going to get our lives in order when the latter rain comes, and we're not going to prepare for the close of probation, second advent. It's all centered around the National Sunday Law. That's what everything is centered around. The problem is when you take those statements, those thus saith the Lord, and you analyze them in detail, a problem arises. And this is the problem, that you cannot take those inflection points in history in an isolated fashion. What do you need to do? If you read inspiration, we say you need to read contextually. You need to understand context. The National Sunday Law is not going to happen in a vacuum. There has to be some context around that event. And it's the same with the cross. You can't look at the cross in a vacuum. It needs to have some context around it. And what becomes surprising, and if we were to, if a Seventh-day Adventist were listening to this presentation today, they wouldn't believe it. They wouldn't believe what I'm about to say. Why would they not believe it? Because it doesn't fit in their perspective of a thus saith the Lord. A thus saith the Lord would put what waymark as its premier event? The Sunday Law. But when you start looking carefully, you actually see that it's not the case. The Sunday Law is not the premier waymark. In fact, it's going to come and go, and most people aren't even going to be aware of it. As I said, if you ask a Seventh-day Adventist, could that be a reality, a possibility? No one would ever believe you. And this is the dilemma that we face. So I want to ask you a question. If you're familiar with the line of the priests, Levites, Nethians, etc., not everybody is so au fait with those things. If we were to talking about Sunday laws, how many Sunday laws do we speak about? So one person said 1 and one person said 4. We'll go with the 4. There are 4 Sunday laws that we have to deal with. How many Sunday laws have we dealt with thus far? So someone said 1 and someone said 2. So for those of us who don't know what we're talking about, I'm sorry. It's a bit much to explain. For those of us who do know what we're talking about, why did you say 1? Have you forgotten what today is? Today is the Sunday Law. Sunday Law number 2. We're already here. We're halfway through everything. People are questioning. I can see people's faces. What on earth is he talking about? Because we're so fixated about 2014, we forget other lines. So I'm not going to do this justice. This is the line of the priests. We have a time of the end, and we have a second advent, and we have a close of probation, of course, and then we have a Sunday law. You agree with that, Sister Marie? Yep. 2014. You go to the line of the Levites. They're also going to have a time of the end and a second advent. What also must they have? Sunday law. You agree with that? And then if we did the Nethinims, they would also have a Sunday law. Yeah? So this one is 2014. This one is 2019. Hence we said there's 2. Sound a bit better now? Yeah? Do you know why this one is?
No, I don't know.
You do? Why?
Well, this is the 126. I know why it is.
Okay, so you say because of the 126 and the 2520. So I would suggest the reason we know that's a Sunday law is not just because of that event or those time spans, but you have to go to a thus saith the Lord, which is the one that we went to earlier when we had 1798, 1844, Sunday law, close of probation, second advent, it's based upon this. It's based upon this model of ploughing, former rain, latter rain and harvest. It's based upon this model that we know it's that. So what you are suggesting is the reason you know it's the year is because of some time spans, 2520 and 126. But the structure itself is taken from this, because you can't just pluck out a time span, arrive to a date. You need to have some context around it, if you could agree with that. So if you have some context around this event here, the context would be what? Close of probation and former rain. I'll put 9/11. So you need to have some context around it, otherwise it sits in isolation. You agree with that? The reason why that becomes significant is because a few years ago, what were people saying about 9/11? 9/11 was? No, Sunday law. People say it was a Sunday law. And if it's a Sunday law, however they arrived at that, rightly or wrongly, what would you have to prove for it to be a Sunday law? What do you have to understand? Context. Context means what's on the left and what's on the right. And what should you expect to be on the left of a Sunday law? On the left of it. Former rain. And on the right, latter rain. And that's why you can demonstrate that 9/11 was never a Sunday law. It was never a Sunday law, because what people were doing, they were taking models from one line. Which line? This one here. And they were projecting that onto 9/11. And just projecting information is not enough. You okay with that? It's not enough. So what information was projected? Just want to run through this exercise. It's not the direction we wanted to go to. Just want to run through this logic. What information was going to be taken from the Sunday law here, Daniel 11 verse 41, and projected onto 9/11? Great controversy. Chapter 38, page 603, I think. You're not sure? Nope. That's 608, I think. We need to be sure. We need to know why things were said, why things were done, so that we might understand what the correct understanding of something is. So we're on Great Controversy, chapter 38, page 603, paragraph 1. Hopefully you've got it in front of you by now, enough time. What does it begin with?
The world is no more ready.
Nope, GC 603, paragraph 1, chapter 38.
No.
Subject is called the final warning. I saw another angel come down from heaven having great power. What's she quoting from? Revelation 18, she quotes verses 1, 2 and 4. She's going to tell you what the premier waymark is, by the way. What's the premier waymark? The title? Final warning is the premier waymark. Adventists turn that into what?
Sunday law.
The Sunday law. See, already you know we're doing something wrong. So what we did was, we took this symbol here, Revelation 18, I'm going to do verses 1 to 3. We took that event, which Ellen White gives us, so thus saith the Lord, and what did we do to it, Sister Marie? We projected it to
9/11.
Projected to 9/11. We say the angel of Revelation 18 came down at 9/11, and therefore 9/11 is a Sunday law. That's what we used to do, and it's wrong, because it's not enough evidence, it's not enough witness, and when you investigate further by using context, you've got to use context, which means check what came before and what came afterwards, and then what you find. It's not a Sunday law. So even though you can go 2014 and do a calculation, 126, and you can come to that point, it's not enough. You have to have other information. So we started creating this line, so now we can create another line here. So this other line can be created using two testimonies or two models. One of them is this one, and the other one is this one. And also 2019, you can do not just a 1, 2, 6, you can do many calculations to bring you to 2019. And the problem is, if you looked at them, they may not, in fact most of them don't, identify a Sunday law. Some may allude to them, some may not. So you can do the same thing with 2019. After that it becomes a bit more problematic. But 2019 is a Sunday law in this line. 2014 is in this line. 9/11 was never one. So are we okay with that? Christ was meant to come back before 1888. She explains in 68 why there's been this delay, because people aren't ready. Had Adventists, after the great disappointment, this is Last Day Events, page 37, paragraph 2, had Adventists after the great disappointment in 1844 held fast their faith and followed on unitedly in the opening providence of God, receiving the message of the third angel, and in the power of the Holy Spirit, proclaiming it to the world, they would have seen the salvation of God. The Lord would have wrought mightily with their efforts, the work would have been completed, and Christ would have come ere this to receive his people to their reward. It was not the will of God that the coming of Christ should be thus delayed. And this is being written in 1883. So okay with that? In 1883. For 40 years, did unbelief, murmuring and rebellion shut out ancient Israel from the land of Canaan. The same sins have delayed the entrance of modern Israel into the heavenly Canaan. In neither case were the promises of God at fault. It is unbelief, the worldliness, unconsecration and strife among the Lord's professed people that have kept us in this world of sin and sorrow so many years. So did God's people fail? Sounds like a failure to me when you read that. So one of the arguments that we have made in the movement is that Christ wanted to come in that dispensation. The reason he doesn't come is because God's people fail. She says the same sins have delayed the entrance of modern Israel into the heavenly Canaan. So we've sinned, we've rebelled, we've failed in our mission. When I say we, who is she referring to? Who is this group of people? This is the Millerites. This is why we say that the Millerite line was a line of failure. They did not accomplish their task. So God's going to raise up a new movement. We have this generic term calling it the 1888 movement. And what God wanted to do was correct a number of issues. Essentially, God's people are teaching the Sabbath, which they equate to the third angel's message, but it's a bit more complex than just the Sabbath issue. There are other components that are involved in rectifying the mistakes of the past. Come 1888, and that whole history, the church fails in its mission then to accomplish the work that God had given to it. Not identifying who the failure is. Most people, when they analyse that history, they have a misunderstanding that, the church or the leadership rejected the message of Jones and Wagner, and that's why we're in this mess today. You know that can't be true. You know it cannot be true to blame the leadership of the church for the mess. And what I mean by the mess, the fact that we're still here on earth today. Can't be so, can it? The reason is, you go back to the history of Christ. You've got two people. John and Jesus. If you like, we'll call them Jones and Wagner. And who are they fighting against? The Sanhedrin, the leadership of the church. Did the leadership of the church in the time of Christ accept the message? No. They were the leadership of Laodicea. Laodicea is going to be destroyed. John chapter 2, Christ identifies the temple as my Father's house. And I'm the Son. And I'm here to clean up your mess in my house. By the time you get to Matthew 23, the same house is now being called, verse 38, your house. God has already disowned that house, and we discussed this in, I think it was yesterday's presentations, or maybe the day before, about how we deal with the issue of the earthly and the heavenly sanctuary, Christ being the high priest. So we know in the history of Christ that the leadership of the church failed. Did the movement succeed? Yes, it did. Because Ephesus, which began with John, went on to Christ, and we went on to Paul. We just identified those three people. If you think about in the context of that, did the gospel go to the known world? Yes. Was it successful? Yes. They accomplished their task. So the line of Christ was a line of success. Everything went right. Even though some of the people in the movement got things wrong. Even though some of the people in the movement were false brethren. The movement itself accomplished its task. Prophecy was fulfilled. You come to the Millerites, the dynamics are not like that. You come to the 1888 history, you can't blame the leadership of the church for failing in its mission. The subject is complex, but you have to identify the blame and put it where it belongs. Fairly and squarely, I would suggest, upon the shoulders of Jones and Wagner and those people that joined them. They're the ones that failed the test. They may have the theology right, but they don't get everything else correct. Or at least some of the theology correct. So, just give them the text to show that Christ was meant to come back pre-1888. They fail. He was then meant to come back in the 1888 history. I don't have a time frame how or when that would have happened. But we do know that life would have looked a lot different. The Second Advent and the events that precede it, closed probation, national standard law, all of that would look different to what it does today. And the problem is what we're doing, and this message has been given over and over again now, but some people still struggle with this idea that the histories that we're dealing with, the history of the Millerites, when Christ was meant to come back, the history of the 1888 period, Joseph Wagner, when he was meant to come back, that those histories do not look like the history in which we live. It was the 19th century coming into the 20th century. This was the Victorian age, and the world did not look like the world looks like today. Even the church itself was struggling. We believe in public evangelism. I'm sure we all believe in that. The church, our church, we also believed in public evangelism. Around the 1870s, they began to be focused on public evangelism. But there were arguments in the church of what public evangelism would look like. And if we know that those arguments were occurring then. And the arguments were like this. I've already sort of given a story about this before. The church wanted to send missionaries abroad. They said, we need to give the gospel to the whole world. Was that possible? In the mind of Adventists, it's not possible because we're only a few people, we don't have the resources to do that work. So they said it was a silly idea to think they were going to convert the whole world by sending a few missionaries here and there and think the work's going to be finished that way. So they came up with this theory. It's a good theory. They said, all of the world has come into which country? into the United States. All the world is here. So all we have to do is convert America, and by proxy, what have we done? Converted the world. So our evangelistic endeavours only need to be contained to continental America, and we've done our job and Christ can come back. Do you think that's a crazy idea? Today you probably think that sounds a bit strange. But do you think that if you go to the Millerite history, 1798, 1844, 1850, 61, 63, 65, that the gospel was going to go to all of the world in that short time period? People might say yes, but if you look at the history, I think an honest assessment would be no. Mr. Wolfe, people may or may not have heard of him, who was basically called the missionary to the world. He'd been doing his missionary endeavours for many, many decades, and even then the whole world hadn't been fully touched. Ellen White talks about the gospel, or the message of salvation, went to every missionary station in the world. There's kind of poetic license to say that, because it really didn't in real life. It didn't go to every missionary station in the whole world. It just didn't happen. There's no evidence that that was true. So we know that the end would have looked different then than it does today. Today we've got a worldwide phenomena. In those days it wouldn't. And back 150 years ago, it was a serious proposition to think that if the gospel went to the United States, by proxy it could be understood to be going to the whole world. I'm not saying that is factually true, but what I am saying is that's what Adventists were considering at that time period, because they were being realistic about what they were able or unable to do. So I just want to make it clear that Christ was meant to come back before 1888. The church fails. He was meant then to come back in the 1888 history, and the church fails. This is why we speak about being careful how we take failed models and bring it into our own history. And this is where people begin to have problems. I want to read something that we are being accused of. So we've done similar presentations like this for many months now, and those people who have left the movement are now reviewing the material that we have put into the public domain and bullet pointing statements that we've made, developing those statements into an idea or a point and saying this is what this movement believes. So this is one of the things they're saying. Ellen White's ministry was a failed ministry. This is what they say we teach. She is to be understood as a prophet whose ministry must be relegated to the time in which she lived. Her words and teachings are not meant to extend to us in this dispensation. Is some of that true? So some people are saying yes. Is all of that true? Do you believe, if I said this is what you believe, would anybody say yes, I believe all of that? No. If I were to say, do you believe some of that? What would you say? Yes, let me give you an example. She is to be understood as a prophet whose ministry must be relegated to the time in which she lived. Her words and teachings are not meant to extend to us in this dispensation. Is that correct? Her words and teachings are not meant to extend to us in this dispensation. Depends. If she said, my words and teachings say you're not allowed to buy a bicycle, do those words and teachings extend to our time period? No. Is that her words and teachings? You shouldn't be buying bicycles. Yeah. You shouldn't be spending all your time, energy and money taking photographs, because portable individual cameras were not available. You had to go to a photographer and he had to set you up, you got dressed, it was a whole affair and it cost money. So we know that there are some things we cannot take that she writes and bring them into our dispensation. So to infer what they're inferring is just a mixture of truth and error, half right and half wrong. every single one of the accusations against us always goes down that ditch. So some of the things are correct and some of the things are incorrect. And the reason why they make this introductory thought, Ellen White's ministry was a failed ministry, is because of this. I said it yesterday, I'm going to repeat it again. So we'll just try and do this quickly. For those of us who weren't here yesterday, you'll have to watch the class because I'm going to go at fair speed, otherwise we won't get through this. Sardis. This is a church in a particular dispensation. So the church of Sardis begins in 1798. Depending on how you want to do this, I'm going to just take it to 1850. And then you get the church of Laodicea. And Laodicea, we know for certainty, begins in the year 1850 and goes to the end. Now you remember when we spoke about captivity. When is captivity supposed to end? Remember Cyrus? Do you remember the story of Cyrus? He says, Babylon's destroyed and you're free to go home. Captivity should end at the time of the end. We agree with that? So that begins to give you the prophetic license that we use to say, what would you expect to see if you want to come out of a Laodicean condition? That you need to be released from that Laodicean condition. You need to be freed from it. When does freedom occur?
Time at the end.
At the time of the end. So we should expect to see a time of the end. I'll put it dotted here. It's not that we just take Daniel 11 verse 40 and invent 1989. We should expect to see an event future to 1850 where our church comes out of the Laodicean condition. And it's not the Sunday law, where some people might think that it belongs. So you're going to come out of this Laodicean condition. It begins in 1850. Laodicea means what? We're going to take a person. The problem with asking rhetorical questions, some people don't know where I'm going. Here's a person. This person is built in two ways. There's the inner person, the heart, and there's the outer person, as Ellen White would call it, the house in which you live. This is the nature of man. We have a threefold nature. I've just shown you two of them. The inside and the outside. We all know that works. What happens at baptism? The inside is made new. The old dies. What happens at the second advent? Any change to the inside? No change at the second advent on the inside. It remains the same. What changes at the second advent? The outside. So, hopefully we're comfortable with that. If you take this idea and we turn it into a coffin, this is Matthew 23. We call it a coffin, the Jews called it a sepulchre. We make them out of wood and bury them 2 meters under the earth. The Jews didn't do that. What did they do with their coffins, their sepulchres? They were above ground, and they're what we call sepulchres. They weren't made of wood like our ones are. They're normally made of marble, sometimes perhaps of stone, and they might paint it white. So in Matthew 23, Christ is going to give a model of that church. He's going to say, you're hypocrites, you're like whited sepulchres, which appear righteous or clean on the outside because they're white, but what are they like inside?
Filthy.
Full of dead men's bones. We familiar with those passages? Yeah. Familiar enough that I don't need to turn to them? Tells you what those dead men's bones are. I think it's 37, 23, no, wouldn't it be 37? 27 maybe. I think it's 23, 27. I'll read that verse to you. 27 and 28. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. And then he's going to tell you what a dead bone means, what a bone means. 28. Even so, ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within you are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. We okay with that? So, there's the coffin. It's white on the outside. So, we'll do that. It's shining in glory. And on the inside, what is it? It's full of dead men's bones on the inside. And dead men's bones is hypocrisy and iniquity. You take that model, it says in verse 28, even so ye. So this is an example of this. What do you look like on the outside?
Righteous.
Look righteous. And what are you on the inside?
Full of hypocrisy and iniquity.
You're dead men's bones on the inside. You're dead on the inside. You're alive on the outside. That's what the condition of the church is there as they're going to come to judgment. If you go to Revelation 14 and onwards, talks about the Church of Adventism, Seventh-day Adventist Church, being in a Laodicean condition, which is lukewarm. Lukewarmness is this in-between state of life and death, because you look like you're alive on the outside. We agree with that?
Yeah.
If you look like you're alive on the outside, does that mean you look good or you look bad?
Look good.
You look good because you're all white. That means you dress right, you speak right, you behave correctly, your hands and your legs all do the right things, you're eating correctly. This is the life of reforms. This is the life of a Pharisee. Everything is done correctly. So when you go to the Laodicean condition, it's not a subject of reform. But these people, what are they like on the inside? They're cold on the inside, hot on the outside. Cold is death, hot is life. So when you combine life and death together, what do you get? Lukewarmness. It's not a real condition, it's a fake condition. What's the biblical word for fake? Hypocrisy, acting. We act as though we're good, but we're bad. And what Adventists want to do, they want you to understand that to be morally. If we were morally so bad, how could we look so good? Because you could spot us. We are morally good people. Go to the Pharisees. They tithe, they fast, they do everything correct, they dress properly, they eat properly. That's Phariseeism, and they're in a really bad situation because they're dead on the inside. So this is Laodicean condition. If you go to Revelation 3 verse 1, we're going to Sardis now, not Laodicea. Sardis is in what condition? They have a name. What's their name? Sardis. It tells you in the verse, William Miller's rule number 5. What does Sardis mean? Don't go to a dictionary, because the dictionary will give you different answers. I'll give you the two dictionary definitions. Sardis means red, definition 1, and Sardis means to come out. We'll go with the dictionary definitions as you turn to Revelation 3 verse 1. What are they coming out of at the time of the end? Captivity. Babylonian captivity. That's why Cyrus says come out, because Sardis means to come out. It also means red. Where does that word red come from, or rouge, or blushing? If you trace all that, it goes back to the book of Genesis. Because what does Adam mean? Red. Adam is red. Red means that you've got blood flowing through your veins, so you look red. Or as they say of David, he was of a ruddy cheek or a ruddy visage semblance. So Sardis means red and means come out. But if you look at the word itself in the verse, it explains itself. What does Sardis mean?
Dead.
No.
Red.
It means to live. It says you have a name that says you live. Can we see that? Revelation 3:1.
Yeah.
Your name says you're alive. What are your works saying?
You're dead.
That you're dead. So we can see, hopefully, that Sardis is actually a mirror image or a copy of Laodicea. Sardis and Laodicea are the same, so you can compare and contrast the two. We'll just put an equal there. Sardis and Laodicea are equal to each other. They have the same problem. Can we see that? So now you know why the Millerite movement was a failed movement, because they come from Sardis, and that's why Laodicea is in the same mess, because they have the same problems. You have two failed movements in two separate dispensations, which are the dispensation of Sardis and Laodicea. That's why they have similar characteristics. For you to have a successful mission, successful movement, you need to come out of what condition? Sardis and Laodicea. You need to come into a new situation. In the history of Sardis, what is that time period called? Philadelphia. We discussed all of this yesterday. So we know that the Millerites have two problems. We'll do it the way we drew it yesterday. Here's the eye of Miller. Miller is a prophet for this dispensation. He's the prophet of Sardis, if I can say it that way. Where Spirit Prophecy quotes that angels directed his mind. That's the definition of being a prophet. They guided and directed him. Where is he supposed to look to?
Heaven.
Heaven. Where does he end up looking to? Earth. After 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Which sanctuary is that? This one here, Daniel chapter 7. What sanctuary does he think it is?
Heaven.
This one here. So he leads everybody in the wrong direction. He says, look here. Well, he's supposed to be telling everybody to look up here. We call this what? Geography. We said he got his geography wrong, and also he got the timing wrong, didn't he? He had a problem with time. In fact, if you go to the history in 1844 itself, in the very last few months, when he starts arguing with Samuel Snow, what does Samuel Snow say? Time. Yes. What does Miller say?
Geography.
No man knoweth the day nor the hour. He actually uses that argument against Samuel Snow, saying don't say Christ is going to return on 22nd of October because no man knows when that's going to happen. He actually uses an argument to attack his own movement. So they have a problem with this issue. To come to our history, this is Ellen White. This is why people are going to say, I teach that Ellen White's ministry was a failed ministry. And I'm not saying that. What I am saying is you can compare and contrast these two histories. And Ellen White's going to tell you what? No time. She's going to tell you there's no time. No man knows when anything's going to happen. And there's a problem with geography in this history. What's the problem with geography? Where are Adventists looking? We're looking here on earth. We call it earthliness or worldliness or the Laodicean condition, which is covetousness. So geography is a problem in the ministry of Ellen White. Can you see they're dealing with the same problems? So what you need to do is when you start dealing with these two histories, you need to handle them in a very careful way. First of all, if we're going to come to our history, we're going to have to deal with two subjects. What are the two subjects? Time and geography. Time. Ellen White says there's no time. The Millerites, they get the time wrong. Not only do they get the date 1843 to 1844 wrong, they're actually failing their mission of actually knowing when the time of Christ's second advent is. So it's a whole mess that they get themselves into. And we know they've got a problem with geography because they don't know where the sanctuary is. All of that distorts and manipulates the first angel's message. That's that history. You come to our history, the history that we call ours, which is the history of Ellen White, history of Seventh-day Adventist Church, and they've got a problem because they're going to say there is no time. Is there no time in Ellen White's dispensation in the period where she's ministering? There certainly is no time. She's correct in that. Now the question is she observing what's happening or is she predicting what's happening? Often when she says no time, we mean that to say there's never going to be a time. And this is again where we begin to differ from where Adventism teaches and where those people who have left the movement are now stuck in. That when she says no time, that is only going to be understood for a certain time period, because there must come a time where the issue of time setting comes back into the message that God's people are to give to the world. So Ellen White is in this dispensation where there's no time. And the geography is what? The geography is the Laodicean condition. Laodicean condition is captivity. I want to read a quote. It's one that I think most of us are probably familiar with. It's taken from Spirit of Prophecy. It's the book of Spirit of Prophecy, volume 4, 4SP. So this is 4SP, I'll give you the page. Page 235, paragraph 2. SP 235, paragraph 2. Now if I were to ask you, as an Adventist, what the criminality of the papacy is, what's wrong with the papacy, what's wrong with Babylon, you'd tell me they've got two problems. The two problems are Sunday sacredness and the state of the dead or spiritualism, depending on how you'd want to explain that. So the state of the dead and Sunday sacredness, that's what makes Babylon, Babylon. And I would say that you're wrong in that. If you believe that that's what makes Babylon, Babylon, you're incorrect. We dealt with this issue a few days ago, and what's the subject? Dispensationalism, because it's all connected to dispensationalism. And other code words for dispensationalism is the Left Behind series that we're familiar with, the Secret Rapture. One word that we didn't use was the millennium. So when you start thinking about the millennium, they take that from the Bible, but they have a misunderstanding of all of that. So dispensationalism is dealing with what subject? Literal to literal. You need to go back and review those classes if you weren't here to listen to that. But connected to all of this, I spoke about two men, Darby and Schofield. Connected to all of those two men who are Protestants, there's what we call the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation was the work of the Jesuits after Martin Luther had come and gone. They began to develop this whole new theology that was basically going to take Christianity off track. So all of those issues all come together in this subject. And it's all to do with the problem of the papacy. They don't just have a problem with Sunday or the state of the dead. So I'm going to read this. 4SP 235, paragraph 1. It begins with the word prominent. What does prominent mean? Outstanding. The most important. Prominent among these false doctrines is that the temporal millennium, 1,000 years of spiritual peace, and prosperity in which the world is to be converted before the coming of Christ. This siren song has lulled thousands of souls to sleep over the abyss of ruin. So there's a premier false doctrine, and it's what? It's the millennial subject, or the 1,000 years of peace. This is the secret rapture. This is the argument that's going to be used in the history of the Millerites. In this history here, if you look at the chapter title here, what's the chapter title? Second Angel's Message. It's this argument that the Protestants are going to say, no time, we don't know when Christ is going to come. And the Millerites are going to say, we do know. Because the Millerites, which is the precursor of Adventism, it's the plan of Adventism, is going to take this church step by step out of captivity. 3 points. It's the issue of time, it's the issue of Sunday, and it's the issue of spiritualism, or state of the dead we call it. We know that, paragraph 2, the doctrine of the natural immortality of the soul has opened the way for the artful working of Satan through modern spiritualism, and besides the Romish errors, purgatory, prayers for the dead, invocation of saints, etc., which have sprung from this source, it has led many Protestants to deny the resurrection and the judgment, and has given rise to the revolting heresy of eternal torment and the dangerous delusion of universalism. That is the state of the dead, if you didn't pick that up. Even more dangerous and more widely held than those two, are the assumptions that the law of God was abolished at the cross, and that the first day of the week is now a holy day instead of the Sabbath or the fourth commandment. Then you have the 3 doctrines. The one that's prominent in this dispensation is the subject of time. And that's why the Millerites are going to deal with the subject of time. So when we go into a Laodicean condition, what I'm saying the Laodicean condition is we're going to go into captivity to whom? To the papacy. We're going to imbibe papal doctrines. And the reason why Adventists feel so secure is because we didn't imbibe 2 of them. We didn't imbibe the doctrine of Sunday sacredness. We rejected that. And we didn't go into spiritualism, which is the state of the dead. We weren't going to be lost on any of those 2 issues. The reason is because we were going to hold to the Word of God, and we didn't get wrapped up in the knock-ins that were happening in that dispensation, and the third angel's message, which is really the subject of the Sabbath. But what we got trapped in is the subject of time. We lost our prophetic message, and we began to teach what? That there's no time. This is what Laodicea is. The Laodicean condition says that there is no time. That's why the Laodicean condition ends when? At the time of the end, which is 1989. If you go back to the story that we read a while back about Zechariah, does everybody leave at the time of the end when Cyrus says go? They don't. They don't leave captivity. This Laodicean condition is being captive theologically to whom? To those papal Romish doctrines. But they weren't fed to us by the Catholic Church. Who fed it to us? Apostate Protestantism. Yet we actually read here, I'm going to cut into a paragraph. It says, besides the Romish errors, etc., it has led many Protestants to deny the resurrection and the judgment. It goes from Catholicism to apostate Protestantism, and then from apostate Protestantism, we have imbibed that doctrine. And the doctrine that we've imbibed is that there is no time setting. And all Ellen White is doing is just commenting on the fact that as Laodicea, we have no idea about what time is. And we need to come to a point in history where we get to the time of the end where time kicks back in. But as it was in the days of Zechariah, after the first group of people come out, what do they need to do? Zechariah 2:6. You need to give a message to the remaining Adventists to say what? Ho ho, flee from the doctrine of the King of the North. The doctrine of the King of the North is what? Time setting. Or dispensationalism, secret rapture, depending on who you ask, they frame it in a different way. So this is what we're being accused of, or I'm being accused of, when I say, I say this. Ellen White ministry was a failed ministry. That's not true. Ellen White's ministry was not a failed ministry. Her ministry is God is raising up someone to take care of his church when they're in what condition? In a Laodicean condition. In a Laodicean condition, you have no idea about time. And what is an Adventist who wants to make a name for themselves going to do? They're going to say, I've got this really neat study that I think I can predict when Christ is going to come back, or the close of probation, or the Sunday law. Fanaticism rises up. And who is the fanatic that we read about? Second Selected Messages, page 18 to 81. What was her name? Anna Phillips. She has a false prophetic message, and it's connected to what? Time setting. She has a component of time setting in her message. And so Ellen White is going to have to deal with people like Anna Phillips throughout her ministry, because everybody wants to make a name for themselves and say, we know when things are going to happen. So she's going to say unequivocally, no time setting in the history or the dispensation of Laodicea. That's what all this no time is that Ellen White's referring to. And this has to be understood dispensationally. It cannot be understood in any other way than that. So come the time of the end, 1989, you cannot hold on to those spirit prophecy quotes and use them in the same way that she did. So let's go back to the accusation. Ellen White's ministry has failed. It's not failed. She is to be understood as a prophet whose ministry must be relegated to the time in which she lived. I'm saying her comments on bicycles, which is obviously trivial, but on these important subjects of no time setting, can only be understood in her dispensation. It cannot be understood in the period in which we're living. Hopefully we can all agree with that. Her words and teachings are not meant to extend to us in this dispensation. Her words of no time setting must be understood properly in their context, and then understood that they don't apply to the history in which we live, which is the history from 1989 onward to the Second Advent. They cannot be applied in that context. And that is extremely significant and important for us to understand. And the reason for that is because all of this issue revolves around how you approach inspiration. Are you going to approach inspiration contextually, or are you going to take things out of context without understanding what is happening when those comments or those statements were being made? The subject is more complex, of course, because you have to go into all of those passages and read them carefully to apply them properly. Now, if we know that they've got a problem with geography, and these people have got a problem with geography, they've got a problem with time, and these people have got a problem with time, then what I want to say, which is, I guess, the premier argument that all of these people have against us, Future for America, and the people that follow them, the problem that they have is that not only were we saying there's a problem with geography, there's a problem with time, but we need to be careful how we read. And when you read, you need to do two things: understand progression and understand repeat and enlarge. And it affects how you deal with literal statements. Literal statements must be understood spiritually. If you don't understand them spiritually, you will make a mistake. Now, this little phrase here, from literal to spiritual, is the definition of parable teaching. Hopefully you all know that. You go from the natural to the spiritual. But it's also one of William Miller's rules. He says, you read a passage, and how are you supposed to read it? Literally. You read it literally, and if it doesn't do any disservice, it stays literal. But then you have to be careful, because if you see any problems with making it all literal, you then have to now consider that passage in its spiritual context, and if you want to make any use of that passage to yourself. Now, the reason why that becomes significant is because if I said to you, thou shalt not steal, are you going to spiritualize that away? No. And in fact, you can go to any moral statement, which is how most of inspiration is understood. When you look at it morally, it will always go from literal to literal. It'll always be that. Lying 2,000 years ago is the same as lying today. Stealing is stealing, adultery is adultery. It's always the same, it never changes, literal to literal. But when you start dealing with prophetic subjects, you can never, ever go from literal to spiritual. It always has to go, literal to literal. It always has to be literal to spiritual when you see things prophetically speaking. So, let's go to Exodus chapter 20, verse 9 to 11. You don't need to turn there, you already know the verse. This is the Sabbath. This is the Sabbath commandment. Verse 8 says, remember. Verse 9 tells you what to remember. It ends in verse 11. Not coincidence that it's Exodus 20, verses 9, 11. So, there's that Sabbath commandment. Now, is the Sabbath commandment a moral issue? Yes, of course it's a moral issue. The Ten Commandments are moral. So if they're moral issues, what do you need to do? You take the literal seventh day, 2,000 years ago, and you take it and you keep it literally. What are you supposed to do in our history? Take it literally, because it's a moral commandment. Therefore, what are you required to do? Keep the seventh day Sabbath. We call it Saturday. You have to keep Saturday because it's a moral issue, and you go from literal to literal. So okay with that? Is that the only way to understand the Ten Commandments? Of course it's not. The Ten Commandments have to be also understood as being prophetic commandments. And therefore, when you take the Sabbath commandment, which was literal, you have to understand it spiritually. So when we start dealing with the Sabbath commandment spiritually, then that opens a whole different avenue of research. Now we're dealing with this thing prophetically, therefore you cannot take it literally. What's the, if I can say it this way, what's the sister of Sabbath? Sunday. The arch nemesis, if you don't like sister. So if it's literally Saturday 2,000 years ago, the next day is going to be literally Sunday. Let's deal with this morally. Morally today, if we're keeping Saturday, what should a Catholic keep? Sunday. It's a moral issue. They understand it's a moral issue. That's why they tell you you're not doing well in God's eyes if you don't come to church on Sunday. They understand that, morally speaking. But what we have confused ourselves in is that when we start dealing at a prophetic level, that's when we begin to become confused. That we think we can take Saturday and Sunday, morally, make it into a prophetic subject and still keep it Saturday and Sunday, prophetically speaking. So I've introduced that thought and I haven't finished it, but I need to add one more thought in. And this is the complexity between progression and repeat and enlarge. Because Ellen White is going to deal with her message progressively, not with repeat and enlarge in the way that we do. So she's going to take you with this one line, and she's going to say, today, what do we need to do? Literally keep what? You literally keep Sabbath. When did she learn that? We'll just do 1844. It's not in 44 that she learns it. It's 45 into 46. This is Joseph Bates teaching her. All I want us to see, they're dealing with a literal Sabbath on what day number? 7. In that history. Now, when is Christ going to come back? In her lifetime. How many generations is that? 1 generation. So how many lines is that? 1 line. There's this 1 line here. So what she's going to do, she's going to see in 1 line, you're not going to jump from literal to spiritual. In your history, everything remains the same. So her story is that in the future, there's going to be a test, and this test is going to be on the 7th day Sabbath, and it's going to be literally. It's all literal. What country? Literally America. Literally America. It's all literal. But she dies. That generation passes away. A second, a third generation comes, and then we are born. And now we're talking about an interdispensational issue. Now we're going from one dispensation to another. And when you jump from one dispensation to another, you can't go from literal to literal. You cannot do that when you take a prophetic subject. So that's why when we come to our dispensation, we'll call it the history of the 144,000, we can't take things literally, we're going to take things spiritually. If you want to take the 7th day Sabbath at a moral level, we'll keep the moral 7th day Sabbath for sure. But when you start dealing with it at a prophetic level, you cannot understand her writings, which was for her dispensation, to be understood literally, and bring it into our dispensation and understand it the same way. Does that mean we throw her writings away? Of course it does not, because without her writings, we wouldn't even know there's going to be an issue. Not only her writings, obviously the Bible itself, we can't separate the two. But we have to understand them and read them in the correct way. So when she says, no time, we don't take that statement and bring it into our one, do we? We can't do that. We can't take her writings and make them apply in this literal fashion in our own history. So when we are accused of saying Ellen White's ministry is failed ministry, of course it's not failed. Is she taking care of a failed church? Is she taking care of a failed church? Is Seventh-day Adventist in Laodicean condition a church that's failed its mission? Of course it is. So she's the prophet of a failed church. The church is in failure, and she's the prophet of that church. So it's not that she's got a failed ministry, it's that she's got a failed flock. The household of God is failed. And we looked at the word dispensationalism, if you remember. The rules and regulations of a failed church or a scattered church, are they the same rules and regulations of a successful church or a church that's going to be gathered? No. Early Writings, page 74. If we look to the scattering to see how God would deal with us today, what would not happen? We couldn't be gathered because the rules are different. So the rules of scattering, the rules of Laodicea is what? No fanaticism, which is no time setting. Don't do time setting, because if you time set, it's a fanatical experience. So she's residing over a failed church. She is to be understood as a prophet whose ministry must be relegated to the time in which she lived. That's crazy. Everybody knows all these things were written, all these things happened for our admonition upon whom the ends of the world have come. So we're going to take her writings and we're going to apply all of them to our own history. It's just that we need to do that carefully. Hopefully we can all assent to that. We don't take the writings of Moses in Leviticus where he says you need to commit a sacrifice. We don't take that and bring it into our history, do we? How many of you check your labels when you buy clothing? And if it said 50% cotton, 50% polyester, you'd say, I'm not buying that. Maybe you would because you don't like polyester, you don't like wearing nylon. But if it was 50% cotton and 50% wool, perhaps you wouldn't have a problem because they're both natural fabrics. But you know in the Old Testament, you're not allowed to do what? Wear a clothing which is comprised of mixed fabrics or mixed material. You're not allowed to do that. We don't take those things literally and bring them to the end of the world. Why don't you do that? We don't stone people who misbehave. It's not even that the law stops us from doing that. We just think it's wrong to do that. So we don't read the Old Testament and bring all those statements literally. We carefully pick and choose what we're going to do. And by the way, I don't know if you're aware of this, but when we started dealing with the health message in the 1860s, in the 1850s, a brother called Haskell, which you all probably know, said, from his reading of the Old Testament, we're not allowed to do what? Eat pork. So there's no more pork eating. You know why he said that? Because it said it in the book of Leviticus. And he says if it's in the book of Leviticus and it applied then, what does it do? It applies now. So he wanted to take Leviticus, the ceremonial law, and bring it into a present-day dispensation. And what did Ellen White say? No. So when we actually introduced the concept of not pork eating, it's just one issue, the leading people in the church are aware of what the issues are, and they say the argument is this: we don't eat pork not because it's a ceremonial issue that Moses brought up. We don't eat pork because we believe it's physiologically unhealthy. They use a health argument not to eat pork. They do not use a ceremonial law, which is from Leviticus, to make their argument. You know why? Because they say, if we did that, you know what those Protestants are going to do? They're going to shackle us. Because they're going to say, you can't do what? Pick and choose which bits you like and which bits you don't like. They were well aware of those arguments. So their argument was, we don't eat pork for physiological reasons, not because of a ceremonial law that's given in the book of Leviticus. Because if we did that, they'd say, well, you don't treat your fields that way, and you have, I don't know, a bull and a goat pulling your plough, or you have mixed fabrics. You do all these things which are breaking all these Levitical laws. Why'd you pick on the issue of swine's flesh? So they were aware of this issue, and they laboured to make sure that people understood it was not a ceremonial issue. I think we don't know that today, and often people having these arguments take you straight back to Leviticus, and you get yourself into a huge mess when you do that. So all I want to say is, when you start going back into Ellen White's writings and start projecting them in a literal fashion into our history, you get into problems. Ellen White didn't have that problem in her dispensation. So when she says it's all going to happen in America, it's all a done deal, it would have been if Christ had returned in her history, but he didn't. He never returned then, and the world is a different place. And there is no way that we're going to have a Sabbath Sunday argument across the world with 7 billion people. And the reason we're not going to have that is because of the subject of fractals. We've dealt with the subject of fractals, and fractals mean scalability. Sabbath and Saturday work for you because you're a Seventh-day Adventist. They work for the church. They may even work for the United States, which is Protestant America. They may even work for a few countries in Europe. But you can't get that scale and project it into other countries across the world. They don't even have a concept of Sabbath and Sunday. They don't have a religious framework. It's just not going to work. Their issues are completely different. Point one. The other point is, not only are we dealing with progression, you also have to deal with repeat and enlarge. And this is where Future for America get into a huge mess. If you remember here, they get into a mess because they want to take 2019 and make it what? Daniel 12 verse 1, which is repeat and enlarge. They want to do this repeat and enlarge. They don't want to deal with progression. Remember that? What comes first, 2019 or Daniel 12:1? Daniel 2019 comes before that. It's a progressive history, if you remember that. We had one picture here and one picture here. They do this one for this story. Then they say, you know what? So this is repeat and enlarge, as Future for America teach it. Then they say, let's go to 2014. We'll put it in quotation marks. It's a Sunday law, not real, fake, whatever it means. We just call it a symbol of a Sunday law. As we step through history, what we're going to arrive at? The real Sunday law. We're going to go from pretend to real. What does that sound like? Repeat and enlarge or progression? Which one? Progression. They're going to say we're going to go from this one and we're going to progress, evolve to the real Sunday law. So sometimes they want to choose repeat and enlarge only, and sometimes they want to go for progression only. This is the ditch that they've entered into. They're not willing to take both concepts and deal with a specific issue correctly. So here's the Sunday laws that we have. We said there's 4 of them. Are they going to be progressive? Yes. Of course they're going to be progressive. Are they going to be repeat and enlarge? Yes. Of course they're going to be repeat and enlarge. You have to have both characteristics, not one. Future for America and their followers, if they're listening, what you are doing wrong is that you're taking this model and you're saying it's only progression, and you're taking this model and you're saying it's only repeat and enlarge. And what this movement, the true movement of God, is saying is that 2014 is the Sunday law, progression, correct, and it's the Sunday law, repeat and enlarge. Which means, if it's repeat and enlarge, this Sunday law is the same as what? This one, and this one, and this one. They're all the same. They're all the same characteristics. 2 weeks ago, we had a problem in this movement. We had a big problem. The Bible says, upon the testimony of 2, a thing is established. How many testimonies for Sunday laws did we have? Yesterday. 1. We only had 1 witness, 1 testimony. Now we've got 2. We've got 2 testimonies. Upon the testimony of 2, a thing is established. We have now established unequivocally that there will be no Saturday, Sunday, this kind of one, Sunday law test in the world for the next 2. It just can't happen if you want to follow rules. Because we've got 2 testimonies for this. You have to take progression and Sunday and repeat and enlarge. Is the subject going to escalate? It will. It will become increasingly pointed, the fight, the struggle. But it will be the same issue. Because you have to factor in progression and you have to factor in repeat and enlarge. We come to this one. Do we say that Daniel 12:1 is a shut door? For sure. Is 2019 a shut door? For sure. Do you go back to the original model? Is there a work to do for those people who pass Daniel 12:1? There is. In this time period, Jacob's time of trouble, is that talking about someone good or bad? Good, because his name is Jacob. It's Jacob's time of trouble. It's not time of trouble for the world. That's the plagues. Jacob's time of trouble is he needs to do what in his life? He needs to get his life in order, doesn't he? Isn't that what Jacob's time of trouble is about? He needs to get his life in order. So, however you want to argue that Daniel 12:1 is the close of probation, he that is righteous will remain righteous, is your life in order yet? It is not. Give me two witnesses. Elijah's life isn't in order. His life is a mess. Jacob is struggling because he's fighting against God and he has to get assurance that everything is good between him and his Lord. So when we take 2019, we have this shut door. It is a shut door. Is there further work to be done in the lives of God's people? Of course there is. So we know that 2019 is progressive. There are 4 clauses of probation which Future for America refused to accept. 2019, 2021. The Sunday law is number 3, and Daniel 12:1 is number 4. They're the 4 clauses of probation, and you have to walk your way through all of those and get to the final one, which is this one, which is the one that inspiration speaks about. It's this progressive nature. They'll all have the same characteristics. Plus, it's a repeat and enlarge. So there's a shut door, there's a shut door. There's an experience to go through, there's an experience to go through. So it has all the same characteristics. You have to factor in progression and repeat and enlarge for every single one of these waymarks. Let me ask you a simple question. Is 1989 the time of the end? Don't say yes, because it depends. The time of the end is 1798. Here is 1989. Can you see I've got 2 histories here? I'm going to join them. This is the story of the SDA Church. In the SDA Church, how many beginnings can you have? 1. It's 1798, the time of the end. Therefore, this one here, stuck in the middle somewhere, 1989, is at the time of the end. It cannot be. What are we doing? Repeat and enlarge and progression. You always have to factor both of those in. If you don't, you end up getting to a place where Future for America now is, they're off the path and they fall into the wicked world below. These are only a few of the accusations that they level against us. And hopefully, not that I've just demonstrated to you, but you can do a self-check. If you believe that the accusations that they're leveling against you are valid or not. We looked at dispensationalism, we looked at the ministry of Ellen White. What they do is they manipulate and twist what's being taught. When I say this, Miller and Ellen White, when they're compared together, where this is a bad church and this is a bad church, people are going to say, well, that means you're teaching me Ellen White is a bad prophet. It's not the case. All of us, including Future for America, know that when she says no time setting, we just say, actually, we're going to ignore you. However they want to phrase that, I might phrase it in more caustic language, but they believe the same thing. They're not going to take her statement and bring it into our dispensation. What they do is they take this concept of time and they twist and manipulate it, and it's well worth your reading. Second Selected Messages, page 80 to 81. I'm not going to reread it, but as we close now, I just want to read one portion from that that we didn't read, if I can find it. Second selected messages, page 81. The letter is sent to someone called Mr. Garmeyer. Garmeyer has a problem. Not only has he a problem, he had a problem, his daughter had a problem, his wife had a problem, and his children had a problem. The problem they have is with Alan White. We stopped there. She said, there are many ways to evade the truth, Mr. Garmeyer. And then she says this thing, you seem to have a special bitterness against Elder Uriah Smith. She mentions that some other people. Why would he have a bitterness against Uriah Smith? Now, if I want to take that literally, maybe Uriah Smith had snubbed him, done something to him. There was some issue between him. I have no idea what the literal issue is. Do I care? No, I don't care. But what I do want to do is, if I want to take this passage and bring it into our history, I'm going to go from the literal to the spiritual. Have I taken Uriah Smith from his literal setting into a spiritual setting in the studies that we've done today? Yes, because you've heard me use his name. So, Uriah Smith is the premier person that's going to teach us what? Daniel 11 verse 40. This is Smith. And today, what does this movement have in their relationship to Smith? If we can use this language. We have bitterness towards Uriah Smith. Why? Because we say he teaches error. He goes to Daniel 11, verse 35, and what he's going to do, 36, he's going to say, the king, and the king shall do according to his will. He's going to change that king and make it a king. Go and read his works, Daniel and Revelation, and he'll show you what he does. We're going to change all of that, and what he's going to do, he's going to go from verse 35 all the way down, and he's going to change everything that you know about those verses, which is in disagreement to what we teach in this movement. So we have a special bitterness towards Uriah Smith. Who's we? This movement, who is we? His name is Mr. Garmeyer. Mr. Garmeyer has this real problem with him. We're making a spiritual connotation. I told you that don't blame Smith. Who should you blame? You should blame Litch. Litch is the problem. Blame Litch. So we're going to start having a problem with Litch now, because we've got a problem with Smith. We're going to have bitterness against Litch, bitterness against Smith. Are you okay with that? Yeah. So the reason why this becomes significant is a few months ago we began to relook at this work, and can't say the movement. The bitterness that I don't know how to say this discreetly. I began to look at this subject. It's about me, that's why I didn't want to talk about it. And the bitterness that I had with Smith, because I had a lot of bitterness with him, melted away when I began to realise the quote that we read in Last Day Events 37. Christ was meant to come when? In the history of the Millerite movement, which means how many time at the ends would you have? One, which would be, it would be 1798. So that means you don't have two time at the ends. So 1989 never even exists. It was never even going to be born. We'd never even get to that year. So that means what Uriah Smith was teaching, was it true or false? It would be true. And the reason why I knew it would be true is because it's not Uriah Smith, it's Josiah Litch. And Josiah Litch writes this statement about Daniel 11:40 in the year 1841. The reason why that becomes significant is because 1841 is just the 1 year after 1840, which is our explanation, our understanding of, if I say it in this way, Revelation chapter 9. Because Revelation chapter 9, you get to August 11th, 1840. So this subject of Daniel 11 is connected to that history. And that history is the midnight cry history of the Millerite movement. 1840 is the midnight cry. You may never have heard of that before, but they've got two midnight cries, because you can get their history and you can cut it into two. They had one in the summer of 1844, and they had one in the year 1840. You've got two dispensations in that Millerite history. So this is connected with the subject of the midnight cry. That's why it caught my attention. So Smith's, Litch's version of Daniel 11 verse 40 is connected to the midnight cry message. And we have bitterness with what? Smith. Therefore you have bitterness with Litch. Therefore you have bitterness with the midnight cry message. Who's got bitterness with the midnight cry message today? Future for America. This is how you go from literal to spiritual. That was just that one liner. You go to the whole passage about what she says about Mr. Garmeyer and his relationship with Anna Phillips. It all fits. But I want to make one more observation. August the 11th, 1840. What waymark is that? Today, for us, what waymark is that in our line? So now people are smiling because they know where they're going. So my brother was willing to take the bait. 9/11. So we've taught for a long time now, 14 years, 15 years thereabout, that August 11th is 9/11. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong, but what I am saying is, I don't think that's the primary waymark for August 11th, 1840. You can show that. The study was done earlier this year in Tahiti. I don't know when it was, May, June time perhaps, maybe April, end of April. So studies were done to demonstrate that. So August 11th can be understood as 9/11. What other year can it be understood to be? 2020. And the reason why that becomes significant is because 2020 is connected to the message of the midnight cry. Now, the reason why this becomes significant is because if you go to the whole story of Daniel 11 verse 40, the subject matter is what? Or the geographical backdrop is what? Islam. Syria. That's its original context. So if you take that and you bring it into our history, what we're saying is in 2020, there's going to be some prophetic fulfillment that's dealing with Islam, with the story or the subject of the Syrian war or the proxy war that's going on in the Middle East at the moment in 2020. And the reason why that becomes important to understand is because the true movement is coming to a point in 2020 using all of this, because we're not bitter against Smith now. Now we love him. Now we like him. He's a good man. But there's Future for America, which is not the true movement, and they're headed to the same year, 2020, through a false path, through the ministry of whom? Anna Phillips. False time setting. We're not saying that they don't time set. They time set, but they do it in a false way because it's Anna Phillips. They have a problem with Ellen White. They also have a problem with Uriah Smith. You can't take these things literally. You have to understand how to do them symbolically. Today, We now love Smith because we understand what he meant when he wrote what he wrote, even though he copied it from Josiah Litch, because we understand what Josiah Litch meant when he wrote what he did. And it's all true, it's connected with the midnight cry. So, the subject of 2020, when you go from 14 to 19, and you have the midnight cry in this history, and we speak about 2020, to reject our version, our understanding of this, is because you have bitterness or anger or hatred against Uriah Smith. And Uriah Smith becomes a symbol of the midnight cry message. That's why there's a difference or a parting of ways between what we understand 2020 to be and what they understand 2020 to be. And therefore, you know, sometime next year, there's going to be something that arises with Islam, and you're going to have two different stories, two different narratives. This subject is not going to die away that easily come November the 10th, 2019. These arguments are not going to just disappear and melt away. They're going to be with us for a time to come. So if you want to know what side you should be on, we have all the information that you need already here. Just have to understand a few principles. Half right, half wrong. The issue of dispensationalism, and also the issue of combining progression and repeat and enlarge. If you keep to those rules and you follow them precisely, you can be kept safe. If you don't, you will fall into the wicked world below, which is where this ministry has already gone, and they're dragging a whole heap of people with them. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we want to give you praise and thanks for your goodness. We ask, Lord, that you would guide, direct, and bless us. Father, there are many things that you want to teach your people. Sometimes we're like expectant children waiting to be fed. Sometimes we're like caregivers feeding those who are unable to take care of themselves. And sometimes we're dressed in battle attire, ready to make war with those who would fight against us. May each of us be ready and willing to fulfill these and other roles that you have given to us at the appropriate time in the correct fashion. Be with us and bless us, Father, particularly on this Holy Sabbath day. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.